Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Hi, my name is Steve. If this is the first time you're joining the channel of Figure It Audi, here I do some work on my A4, S4, and S8. Largely maintenance and modifications on those cars, sometimes a little bit of product and tool reviews mixed in. But today you're joining me on part 2 now of what I'm calling the S4 Redemption series. If you haven't seen the first episode, you can check it out right there. And the whole mantra of this series is trying to figure out where all my horsepower and torque went that seemingly went MIA when I was on the dyno in the fall. Last episode, I did a bunch of health checks and the results were pretty good. Good enough to give me the confidence to actually do a couple more modifications to the car while I've got some things apart. You know when celebrities say one for me, one for them when they're talking about which movies they decide to do? Well, this one's for me today, not for the algorithm. This is when we get deep into one particular topic. So you and I are going to do a deletion how-to of the secondary air injection system, and I'm not going to skip on the science. If at any point during this episode you go, that was kind of interesting, please do throw me a subscribe on the channel and like the video. It really does help out. And also know that you can always find me or DM me if you want on Instagram at Figure It Audi. Now, like any good masterclass lesson, we always have to start with the fundamentals, the conceptual part of why the system even exists in the first place. And I always have had the viewpoint that you should not be modifying your car in any way if you don't understand the system that you're actually affecting. So let's take a look at the purpose of secondary air injection. The really short answer to that is the reduction of harmful emissions coming out of your exhaust system during the first few minutes when you start up your car when it's cold. But to really understand which parts of the system we can delete and why, we got to go a little deeper. Let's begin with the objective, which is to oxidize both carbon monoxide and hydrocarbon in the catalytic converter through a process called oxidation, such that only water and carbon dioxide comes out of your tailpipe. Now, I'm not trying to make a video here about all the ways a catalytic converter works. There's lots of good videos out there. Go Google them later. But the oxidation process I'm talking about that we're focusing on is actually just the second chemical process that happens in sequence in your catalytic converter, the first one just upstream of it being a reduction process. All we really need to care about here is the fact that process number 1 breaks down compounds and then process number 2 reattaches oxygen particles to it to make them a different thing. Now, the problems begin when you start your car, kind of in 2 different ways. One, obviously the car's just not that hot yet, meaning the exhaust gas hasn't had a moment to warm up the catalytic converters up to a temperature where they perform really efficiently and are able to do those chemical processes that we were just talking about. But second, your car is running relatively rich, which means that there's more fuel in the air-fuel mixture that's being burned in the cylinders, which is why you have that high idle when you first start the car and is trying to keep itself warm and going and not dying because everything is cold. Well, that also means that there's less oxygen in the mixture. So even if the catalytic converters were warm, it doesn't have a suitable amount of oxygen to do that second oxidation process. So the entire point of secondary air injection is to give it that extra boost of oxygen during those first few minutes. Therefore, secondary air injection, secondary being in addition to the air that's coming in through the exhaust stream, air is actually ambient air outside of the car, injection being the fact that we're inserting it straight into the exhaust stream so that it can be capitalized in that oxidation process and provide oxygen particles. Once upon a time in your life, and if you're like me, it's been a little while since you were sitting in a high school class, in chemistry, your teacher would have said, oxidation releases energy in the form of heat. Now that right there solves our problems earlier. We do not wait for the exhaust gases themselves to naturally warm up the catalytic converter so it can do its thing. We start right away with the SAI system. We pump oxygen-rich air into the exhaust stream. The oxidation occurs. It releases energy naturally through that process. That warms up the catalytic converter to what's called its light-off point the fastest. And that's the point where it is warm enough to naturally do that reduction and oxidation process very efficiently. So all in all, secondary air injection is a pretty good little invention. It's smart, capitalizes on the fact that you have a catalytic converter already in your car, and it's been around for a long, long time, like decades worth of time in the automotive industry. I all but guarantee it's on your car, unless you drive an electric vehicle probably. And although I live in Alberta, where we don't have government regulated testing on our vehicles to pass each year for emissions controls, I do recognize the fact that it's good for the environment, and you very well could live in a state or province that does have controls, and that's why they call the secondary air injection pump sometimes the smog pump, and it may not be an option for you to remove it from your car at all. So although we're all in agreement now that the planet is important and all that good stuff, maybe you're on the extreme end of the spectrum like I am, where you don't even have catalytic converters. And if that's the case, you simply don't need this system. Additionally, you might also be like me in the sense that you have an ECU tune where it is no longer looking for certain irregularities in your sensors that are related to the emission control and that allows you to remove parts of the system. especially because this is a race car, right? And it's only for off-road purposes only. That's right, so that makes it okay. In general though, I do recommend that you keep your SAI system installed in your car unless you have to remove it or you have a real benefit to removing it. Now keep in mind, I'm going to be doing quite a comprehensive SAI delete that I'll be walking you through here. I'm going to show you a couple different versions if you don't want to go whole hog like me, but I want you to know that I'm not just doing this for fun. Like, yes, I do have the ability to do this because of the coating that comes with the jackal tune that I've ordered, but I also have the necessity for the space savings. I do like the idea in general of just decluttering, but I quite literally need the physical space around the pump right now because I'm finally able to make a true custom cold air intake using the duct on the passenger side of the car that comes through the DTM bumper. Okay, like I said, practical time. Let's take a look at the engine bay, see what's what, how the system works, and call out the necessary changes. Like any other air destined for use in the engine, it has to travel through the airbox itself. Now, obviously, I don't have the left-hand side of my airbox in right now. It doesn't really matter. What's important is that this diagonal right here, we know our air filter sits on that side. So anything that's plugged into the right-hand side of the airbox, you know, is filtered air. That is important because instead of the air for the secondary air injection traveling in the normal path, which is past the airflow sensor and into the intake manifold, it actually gets pulled out of the airbox and to the pump down below out of this tube right here. You may have not ever realized what this thing was plugging into your airbox. This is the intake for your secondary air injection pump. Simply follow that intake tube down and you will quickly find this big circular pump. Here it is, right here. And what you'll also see underneath it is that there are certainly some electrical connectors. Now, that is because these pumps are electrically driven. Back in the day, they may have actually been driven off of the engine, so they were belt driven, but clearly we know that anything that takes engine power to run sucks horsepower away. And also these pumps only need to run for the first couple of minutes, so it makes no sense why it would be constantly running. Instead, what's smarter to do is turn it on electrically and provide power, ground, and a signal to it so you can tell it to run, let's say in the first 2 minutes, and after that, shut off. So you are air. You've been sucked in out of the airbox, down through the tube, into the pump, and you can see there's a matching hose on the outlet side that gets pumped back upwards. And in the case of the S4, right beside the big coolant line right here, there is another metal pipe right beside it. Again, you may have also thought that was for coolant or something. No, that carries air. That is the outlet that's going to send air towards the back of the block. It's a bit challenging to show with the engine in the car, but allow me to illustrate with this diagram. So that hard tube wraps around the back of the block, connects to a hose, and that allows air to travel off to two valves that are located behind each cylinder head. Now, each of those valves sit on top of a small pipe that allows air to actually enter the head and slip in past the exhaust valves. Thankfully, I actually have my S8 block still on the stand so I can show you the backside of these ports are pretty small. They're just here, and I'll use my, a very average length dipstick to show you that it's not just feeding air into the rearmost cylinder behind the valves. It actually goes through the entire head, feeding air to all the valves. The thing is, this pathway that we've covered so far from airbox to exhaust valve isn't open all the time. It has to be opened and closed on command, so enter the combi valves. If you've spent any time under the hood of your car before, you'll probably have noticed those little silver canisters in the back that look like this, exactly like this actually. The other one is going to be back on the other side. They are very much a little tin can looking thing with one vacuum port sticking out of the side of it. And that is important because these are not controlled electronically. They're controlled by vacuum and solenoid. Looking back at the SAI diagram one more time, you can see indeed they are connected by a small vacuum line, which connect together in a, trust me when I say, very brittle plastic line. In fact, all the vacuum hose from there to the front of the car is plastic. It is brittle, it breaks. Mine certainly did when I touched it just one time, which is exactly why I've replaced a lot of the vacuum lines on this car with Vibrant silicone vacuum tubing. Here's a quick look at what Vibrant sells in what they call a pit pack. It's basically just a little starter set with, I think, 5 to 10 feet of hosing in a bunch of different sizes. Really handy. I've used this in a whole variety of places in the car so far, and I'll put the Amazon link to this in the description of the video. This line popping out the front is in fact the one that runs under the intake manifold and connects back to both of the combi valves, and it is plugged into the front port of the solenoid dead center that operates them. Since this is only a 2-port solenoid and it has to get vacuum from somewhere, the somewhere is actually the intake manifold itself. The intake manifold is a great place to pick up vacuum for lots of different components, and the main vacuum line to provide that is this little elbow right here. This is a one-way check valve to ensure that the intake is only ever sucking air in, aka providing vacuum to whatever's in front here, and it can't push pressure back out this way. And there is a main line that comes off the bottom of this tube behind here, trust me, and there is a little T-fitting, which is where the vacuum is being picked up for our solenoid. Maybe to state the final piece of the puzzle, that's a bit obvious, but the solenoid itself is controlled by the ECU. That's what the connector is for. It has the ability to say, hey, switch into state 2 where you are open, allowing the vacuum that it's already sourcing from up here to be applied to the vacuum line all the way behind back to the valves. Okay, practical application time. Can you use what you learned? See if you can pause the video and think about everything I just said and imagine yourself in the driver's seat turning the key. What happens in all those systems all the way from that moment until the exhaust warms up? The correct answer is key on, ECU goes, oh, ambient temperature, a little cold, car's obviously not started. I'm looking at my O2 sensor readings and I can tell that the cats are not seeing a lot of oxygen down there. So let's go ahead and use our secondary air injection system. And at that point, it turns on the pump. The pump pulls air out of the airbox, down, back up through the tube, back up to the combi valves, which are now going to be opened because the computer is also going to say, hey, solenoid, switch into state 2, allow your vacuum source to be applied to the tubing. So the combi valves pop, they both go open. The provided air is being pushed down through them, down into the tubes, into the back of the head, past the exhaust valves, into the exhaust tract, into the catalytic converters, and then kaboom, oxidation. So now we can think about how we can delete things. Since you know the system now, you already know the answer is the pump and its associated hoses can come out. We would no longer need either of the combi valves or any of the vacuum lines or hoses that attach them. And we also would have no use for the solenoid up front. Practically speaking though, you do not need to remove all those parts. You can achieve the same effect of deleting the pump, getting some room if that's your goal, and not have to touch those other things. So I'm going to go through the full process of removal right now, and you can follow along and just decide how much that you need to do. Final word of caution, make sure you understand how your tuner actually coded out the SAI. When you bought your tune, it's probably just a checkbox option on their website that said SAI delete, but you have to understand like what was actually tuned out of it, because now that you know how the system works and you know there's multiple components, if the tuner, let's just say, only is not running the pump on startup, and you go ahead and pull out that front solenoid, well, that could be a DTC on the computer and you don't want that. Same thing goes for potentially messing with the catalytic converters. If it's not ignoring the O2 readings that are coming through, that could be another problem in your computer. So if you're shooting for like 0 DTCs and a perfect clean uninstall of whatever your system is based on your tune, make sure you understand what the tune actually is doing. Before I get going here, I just need to address a couple of differences that are going to be on my car that probably won't be on your car. Depends how far you are in your modification journey, but I have the JHM external oil cooler, and that is because I have deleted my passenger side auxiliary radiator. Now, if you don't know what that is, it is essentially another little radiator. Hopefully you can at least see the fins to believe there's one back there in that duct. There's two on these cars, and that radiator only exists to cool the oil cooler, which I have deleted. So I don't need that, and that's why I'm gonna have such good access to the pump here, and you may not. Likewise, and you'll see it in a second, there is a bracket that holds the pump. I'm kind of tapping on the back of the middle part of it right now. It also is a part of the structural rigidity of holding that auxiliary radiator. So again, I'm going to remove my bracket entirely, but you may not be able to do so. Okay, that is more than enough ado. Let's get to removing the pump because that's going to be everyone's basic removal of the system. And let's get rid of these. I've always found these pinch and pull fittings to be really finicky. Definitely not a one-hander. There we go. I tell you, the gymnastics that I do on this channel to make sure that you guys have a good view, it's no joke. I could always do this work a little easier. Just gonna jump up top to remove the pretty typical style 2-ear hose clamp. It is exactly like this type. And I just wanted to call out the fact that if you don't have a set of hose clamp pliers, you are majorly missing out. They're not expensive, they're super useful. It's just a little tool where you squeeze it and you can articulate this arm anywhere you want. These little hooks here grab on each side of the ear, and when you're done squeezing, it actually holds it in place so you can let go and still have 2 hands to operate on hose clamps. Get on under the car now and take care of one connector up there that is surely to hurt your fingers. And then there's just 2 little 10mm nuts there and there to take care of, and then you can slide the pump out towards the passenger side. JK, there are 3 nuts on there, and I accidentally lied to you twice. I did have to loosen up this bracket just a little bit to get this type of wiggle on here to slide it out the front. And that is done by 10 mil, and there's actually a little 3/16 style Allen head bolt that's on the back of the bracket. Now that I've got all the parts that I'm going to take out related to the pump, I wanted to weigh them. I want to see what we stand to lose for weight on that front right corner. Not that I think a lot of S4s are out there corner balanced. Mine was once upon a time, but I think I've changed enough stuff now where I've probably thrown it off by at least a couple of percentage, but let's check it out. Okay, last hose. 4.7 pounds. Now you're going to be left with that pipe that's open, and I just stuck the airbox back in here to remind you that this hole exists too. And your final step is to just do something about that. Plug them, cap them, do whatever you got to do to make sure that they're airtight. Don't leave them open to suck in hot air from the engine bay that's potentially got weird stuff in it, right? We don't know if your tune hasn't tuned out the combi valves opening and closing, and potentially if you left those ports open, you'd be sucking weird stuff straight into the back of the head, which is bad, so please do take care of that. So potentially your SAI delete is done, but if you want to graduate to level 2 with me and do something about the combi valves, here we go. So I'm not going to lie, this part is not going to be super fun or easy. Typically people would do the full combi valve deletion when they have the engine out for timing and clutch service because you have a lot of access. You're going to be working back on the firewall here and it's going to suck a little bit. Now, not just for the purposes of ease of filming and illustration, I'm going to remove the intake manifold. That's going to give me better access because the throttle body and a bunch of other stuff is going to come with it. So I'm going to pull that off and I will meet you back here in a little while. Now I know that looked like a gnarly amount of work, but this is why you have to do it. I mean, you're just not going to get access to the combi valves with all that stuff in place. And I also just want to say before you jump in and decide to do it yourself, I have a lot of advantages going for me right now. The main one being that I greatly modified the PCV system. So I was able to just pull the entire hose out with the intake manifold and I never had to remove this. You probably wouldn't be so lucky. Likewise, the other PCV hoses I had sort of like, I don't know, quick disconnect access to. And of course, the front end of the car is hanging off, giving me tons of access here to wrestle with the NOx sensor connections and some of the other vacuum lines. It's kind of shitty to have to do this when you're, from scratch without service position, all that good stuff. But this is a great indication of how much work you need to do if you're dead set on getting rid of those combi valves with the engine in the car. Here's proof though that, my life isn't perfect either. This little plastic cap obliterated itself when I barely touched it. These are the caps that you'll find on top of vacuum solenoids. This is the one that actuates the flap inside of the intake manifold. I was barely touching it and it just blew up in my hands. So I'll have to do something about that. It's important to make sure you do have your caps on your solenoids and that the little filter is in place because it needs that to function properly. But these things happen. We're gonna start off nice and easy here, just removing some vacuum lines. First up, locate the Y. You're gonna find it in this exact position. I ran my silicone lines just where the factory ones are. Do not touch this, ignore it, just move it a little bit out of the way because that's actually gonna be first step. So find the vacuum line as it connects to the port on the outer edges of both of the combi valves. So left on that one, and then this one is right here, kind of wraps around the back. Disconnect, disconnect, follow to the front. Find the front port connected to the solenoid here, remove that too. Get rid of the Y. Very good work. Now we're gonna get rid of this tube right in the middle. So get rid of the two 5mm hex-headed bolts that are on the side of each of the combi valves. And then choose your own adventure to remove the band clamp that's right here. This isn't ear clamp style. You're gonna have to cut this or wiggle it and break it loose, but get rid of this guy right here so you can disconnect the hose and this metal fitting right here. Now this is gonna be the step where you're gonna start to question yourself and say, yeah, I'm not doing that. I promise you it's not as bad as what I'm about to show you. Yes, you do have to remove a bunch of things out of the way. There's a fundamental issue here where once you get to removing this combi valve right here, there are two bolts just holding it to a pipe below it. and you'd be tempted to try to just take those out and lift it off and work your way from there, but you can't. So the hard water pipe that connects the back of the two heads right here is very much physically making it impossible to back those two out. So you need to go upstream and not just take off the valve, but you need to go down to where the tube connects into the back of the head. Now to do that, you need working room, and that is why I've moved a bunch of things. Really, all you're doing is taking anything related to the expansion tank. It's just a couple of hoses. There's a few more that are clipped to the back of the firewall. You're just moving it all to the passenger side. Now, the other thing that's going to be in the way is the wiring harness itself. That's why this is all here. So you just have to do a couple of things. There is a P-clamp that's held to a stud right here. You just take off a little 10mm nut and get some movability in here. And then there are a bunch of plugs up on the firewall for things like the front O2 sensor and a couple of other components. Just unplug all those plugs. You're going to notice that there's lots of slack in the lines because of the other earlier work we did. You just pull a little bit of that to the right, and you should be left with an area that looks pretty easy to access here. Because what you're going to do is take a T30 Torx bit and you're going to go down there and take off two bolts that are holding the combi valve feed pipe to the back of the head. Here it is, proof that it is possible, and this is the bolt that I said is impossible to get out before. I stand by that. But what's nearly impossible is this one right here. This one's easy on the outside of the passenger side of the head. This one sucks. I don't have any magic prescription for you. I used all 1/4-inch hardware, so it was all super small and flexible. I used a swivel head, just a whole variety of things on the T30 Torx screw. And eventually I got it, but it was terrible, terrible job. Honestly, I don't recommend that you do this. I can tell you it is possible now, but like, just don't do it. It's a pain in the ass unless you have the engine out of the car. And you can achieve all the same results just by blocking vacuum ports on the front solenoid and on the side of the pipe there. So like, don't worry about it, but at least I've maybe set a record here for Audi history of trying to finagle that thing out. Regardless, let's continue on to the driver's side combi valve now. The driver's side valve and its tube was not a big deal. It seems like the theme is that the inside bolts are the tricky ones, and that might have something to do with all the Loctite that are on these things. And I'm just guessing that these have never been taken off the car before. I honestly don't know. Someone could have done that themselves. And the recipe to success was essentially the same as the other side. I went ahead and unplugged all the stuff on the firewall, took off that bracket so I can get some nice room in here. And I mean, I'm not a huge guy. I got skinny computer wrists. I'm a corporate grunt during the day, so I don't have a lot of beef trying to slip into these little places. But once you get all the harness out of the way, it's just a matter of reaching in. I use a little mirror and a flashlight to see where I'm landing my bit, and eventually just get it out. It's not a huge deal. And now we can finally move on to button up level 2 of the SAI delete by creating some block off plates. Also a quick weigh in on everything related to the combi valves. We've shaved off another 2 pounds. No doubt that it's easy to think about the block off plates as a necessity to stopping that lack of fresh air from being injected into the back of the heads. But now that we've removed the combi valves and those tubes, you actually have to think about it the other way around. Remember when we were talking about how the whole system works and that the air is injected behind the exhaust valves? Well, you got to keep in mind that these tubes and the entire bottom half of the valves are very much exposed to the exhaust gases themselves. You can see in these pictures, kind of sort of, because it's hard to take a picture of something that's black, there is carbon. Basically, there's exhaust soot that travels all the way up the pipes and up into the lower halves of the combi valves. They are definitely holding back exhaust anytime that the secondary air injection system isn't working. The easy way out of this task is simply buying block off plates. JHM sells them for about 30 bucks on their website, and job done for you if you don't want to mess around with the stuff that I'm about to do. But if you are not in the States or you want to be a little industrious, well, you're gonna have to make your own. And I don't think it's gonna be that hard. And I will simply show you what I'm gonna do. I will take the bottom of each of the tubes where it attaches to the back of the head. I will put it on my material. I'm gonna trace it out, and then I'm going to cut it out, and I'm going to reuse the 2 gaskets that sealed it to the back of the head. Now, the perfectionist in me would love to recreate exactly what this material and thickness is. So from the factory, this is aluminum, obviously, and it's 4.5 millimeters thick, I've measured. But I also took one of the bolts that held this to the back of the head, and I ran it all the way down in its threads, and I wanted to see if it would bottom out, and it did, meaning you do not have to use the same thickness of material. That's great, because I couldn't get any. In fact, I went dumpster diving. I got this piece of what I think is galvanized, or at least it's treated in some way, steel. It's 1.5 millimeters thick. And honestly, I just drove to a steel shop nearby and I said, can I please have a piece of cut off that just came off of somebody's table that you don't need anymore? And they were nice enough to let me go through the scrap bin, found that sitting here, and it's perfect because you don't really need a whole lot of material for this project. can't hide from the passage of time with a haircut. So some time has passed, and in fact, in the meantime, the entire event has gone on to coilovers. So that was just to fix an emergency problem. If you have any interest in learning a little bit more about ECS tuning coilovers, you can check out the video right here. Otherwise, the little cover plates are done. So I put some holes for the bolts in there, used my reaming tool to make sure there's no sharp edges on the inside. Likewise, just sanded off the exterior edges to make sure they're safe to handle. And I'm going to use the old gaskets, a little bit of this Optimum Black, and I'm gonna put it back into the car. Even with the combi valves out of the way, putting the block-off plates on was not a fun job. Again, don't do this part. There's an easier way. Also, important reminder, the block-off plate that looks like a triangle goes on the driver's side, and the diamond-shaped one goes on the passenger side. Take a wild guess why I'm reminding you of that. For all the tryhards out there, congratulations for making it this far. For everyone else that has a brain in their head, you would have just put a little vacuum cap on the outside port on the combi valves and you would have been done. And you could have taken out that little Y vacuum hose as well, assuming you're going to do the next step, and let's do that now. And of course that means to deal with the vacuum solenoid up front. Now the easiest thing to do is just put a vacuum cap on the outside port right there, or you might want to remove the solenoid altogether and the vacuum line behind it, and just put a vacuum cap once again on the T-fitting that feeds it vacuum. Or you can do what I'm going to do, and the try-hard route is to join these existing two vacuum lines. But I have a cool little fitting that I think is going to work perfectly for that. My answer to this challenge is simply push lock fittings. I've been wanting to try these for quite some time. The principle is quite simple. You can see there's little silver teeth on the inside, and it kind of works like a compression fitting. You'll just take your vacuum line, push it in all the way, and the teeth grab onto it, and now it's in there. But if you ever want to take it out, you don't have to worry about flimsy little plastic barbed vacuum fittings. You just pull back on the ring on the outside, pull the vacuum line out. I got this pack on Amazon, comes with a 12, 10, 8, and 6 mil fitting, and I'll put the link to that item in the description of this video. And there's that fitting tucked in right down here. Everything about the vacuum system, and truly everything minus the air intake, is all buttoned up here, because that will be very much for next episode. And in the meantime, congratulations. Hopefully you went 3 rounds with me and did a very comprehensive SAI system removal. But at the very least, you plugged up a couple of things, and I hope that you learned a little bit of science and a little bit of hands-on knowledge with your car in the meantime. So please do subscribe to the channel and like this video if it was helpful. And what's coming next time is going to be something pretty cool.